Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. We have talked about the Roman Republic and how that gave way to the Roman Empire, and today we're going to talk a little bit about why the Roman Empire fell. So by the end of this video, what you should be able to do is explain how and why Rome was weakened leading up to when it fell in the year 476, identify and describe the invaders who eventually overran and defeated Rome, leading to its downfall, and also analyzing the effect of the fall of the Roman Empire on the people who lived there. So be thinking about those questions as you watch. In the last video about the Roman Empire, we talked about the good times, how the Pax Romana was going on, which remember translates to Roman peace. There was no war. The emperors were popular and ruled in a way that the people of Rome liked, and so things were pretty peachy keen. The economy was good, people were happy. But Marcus Aurelius died in 180, and he's considered the last emperor of that time period, the Pax Romana. After that, you begin to see some struggles, and things begin to fall apart. Power struggles become very common in the Roman Empire. At one point, in a 50-year period, there were 26 different emperors. So that's a different emperor about every 2 years. And of those 26 emperors, only one died of natural causes. And the rest of them were either overthrown by someone with a military force, or they were simply assassinated. So you have no stability in the government whatsoever, which ends up causing a lot of problems. There are also some economic troubles. In order to pay for having this huge military to control this huge amount of land that Rome has, they pass the bill on to the people in the form of higher taxes. So people don't have a lot of money at this point. They're having to pay all this money to keep the military up. Also, people have been growing too many crops on land, leading to nutrients being depleted from the soil, and that leads to drought and in some cases famine, where people in large numbers don't have food and are starving. So things after the Pax Romana, not terribly good. But a couple of emperors took steps to try to stop the bleeding, as it were. The first of those emperors is Diocletian. Diocletian decided Rome was actually just too big. The empire was way too large to be ruled by one person in one city. So he divides it in half. He creates the Western Roman Empire, which you see on that map there in orange, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which is on the map in purple. And he set up an eastern capital at Constantinople, which you may also know from your map activity as Byzantium. Its name has changed several times. And he appointed a co-emperor that ruled in Constantinople and ruled the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, that co-emperor was still directly answerable to the emperor in Rome, so they weren't equals. But this did take some of the pressure off Rome to rule this humongous expanse of land, right? Diocletian also fixes prices, which means prices cannot go up on goods, and this helps people who are struggling to pay for things like food. And he also passed some other laws to strengthen the economy. Like, for example, he passed a law that said, okay, if you are a shoemaker, your son must also be a shoemaker, for example. And this ensured that jobs were being done and there was some continuity in the economy and that goods and services would continue to be provided. Another emperor who reformed some things was Constantine. Constantine granted toleration to Christians. He's the first Roman emperor to accept Christianity and not persecute Christians, which you learned about some in the last video. About 100 years after Constantine, the emperor Theodosius actually takes it even further and makes Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, basically saying that you have to be Christian. Constantine also moved the capital away from Rome entirely and moved the capital to Constantinople because that area was more secure, had more resources, better farmland, for example, better trade routes, and was a more wealthy city. So that is a pretty big change, as you can imagine. Rome really begins to weaken when the invaders start coming from outside. The first major group that has a direct impact on Rome is the Huns. The Huns came from what would later be known as Mongolia, and they moved west across Asia and were pretty brutal and took over a lot of land, and they landed in what we would now know as Hungary, which is sort of north of the Roman Empire. You can see there on the map. As a result, the groups who already lived in those areas, which were known as Germanic tribes, freaked out, wanted to get away from the Huns, and so they started fleeing toward the Roman Empire because Rome has this humongous army, and they're running and basically banging down the door in Rome saying, help us, protect us, protect us. So you begin to have these outside groups who take shelter within the borders of the Roman Empire. Now, the problem is one of those groups, especially the Visigoths, get tired of the way they were being treated. And Rome started imposing really heavy taxes, for example, on these people who had come in seeking shelter. And they got ticked off and eventually rise up against Roman rule. And they fought the first war against Rome, the Visigoths did, in the late 300s and actually won. So you begin to see Rome weaken. They had a very, very strong military, very strong army, and hardly ever lost anything. And you start to see them lose battles. And it's only going to get worse. It's sort of a snowball effect as time goes on. Another group beside the Visigoths that the Romans had to worry about were the Vandals. The Vandals moved throughout Western Europe and down into Africa, ended up taking over Gaul and what we would now know as Spain, which was called Hispania at the time, and took over a lot of the land in northern Africa that Rome controlled. And Rome was so weak at this point and didn't have the money to keep those areas up, so they weren't able to go take them back from the Vandals. And so those areas in Western Europe never were under Roman control again once the Vandals took them over. The beginning of the end comes with Attila the Hun, who was a particularly ruthless, brutal leader of the Huns. And he's the first person to move really away from Hungary and start moving closer and closer to Rome. And the Romans were terrified of Attila the Hun and called him the scourge of God, basically saying they thought that God had sent Attila to bring reign of ruin upon them because of their sinful ways. This led to even more Germanic people, the Goths and those groups, fleeing into Rome seeking safety from these hordes of Hun armies who were going into cities and just absolutely laying waste to them. And that is going to lead to those Germanic tribes finally overthrowing Rome. There were so many Germanic groups in the Roman Empire that the Roman military couldn't do anything to control them. And in the year 476, the last Roman emperors get overthrown by the Germanic peoples. And that is typically considered to be the end of the Roman Empire as we know it. Now, even though there was no more Western Roman emperor as of 476 when that happened, Rome doesn't completely just vanish from the map. It's not like all of a sudden 476 rolls around, the Goths win, and Rome just sort of blows up. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to actually be very, very powerful, and it later became known as the Byzantine Empire, and it lasted about 1,000 more years after 476 when the Western Roman Empire fell. Constantinople fell to outside forces in the year 1453, so it was almost exactly 1,000 years. And Constantinople, that's the city there in the picture, was a very vibrant, bustling city and had a lot of wealth and a lot of riches and continued to be incredibly powerful in Europe. In addition, people's ways of life don't really change after the Roman Empire falls. They continue to speak the same languages, they have the same customs, same traditions. Christianity obviously flourishes, so the religion doesn't really change. So even though the government is different, people socially and culturally remain very, very similar. So even though the Roman Empire technically falls, its remnants, its legacy, obviously definitely endures. Next up, we're going to do some activities in class, such as a graphic organizer on why the Roman Empire fell, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those causes in depth. You will have some test review and study guides coming your way very soon for the Rome test, so be sure to be checking Moodle and the board in class to get the date for that big assessment on the Roman Empire. Thanks for listening, and as always, ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers!